Hi, church family. Welcome back to episode 3 of The Breakdown. Today we're going to be going over the lesson for February 16th, and that is looking at Acts 5, 1 through 41. And kind of as we get into this, Cody, I wanted you to speak to this a little bit too, but this is a bigger section of a passage, and so there's quite a bit more material to go over. But one of the reasons that I love these bigger passages is because it gets you into the context. It helps you have a longer narrative of what's happening and really see how these things that the Bible is teaching us apply. So, I've preached some of these passages that are longer, but it's because these are unified texts that are trying to teach a message. So, what do you think about these longer passages and how they work in a setting like Sunday school?
So in a setting like Sunday school, it gives you a lot of information to kind of break down. But the most important part that we have to kind of keep in mind here in doing this, it keeps it all in context. So when you're looking at verses and you can look at a specific verse and say, well, this is what this means. But if you look at the entire passage, it may change the way you thought it meant because it means something differently. So like at the end of chapter 5, it really wraps it up as a church-wide thing. But if you just read the first section of chapter 5, you would think it's like a personal story between the two main characters. But really, this entire chapter is really consolidated to mean the entire church and what their thought process should be.
Yep. Well, I love these longer passages because they teach us a lot and they help us understand what's going on in whatever the conversation is. In this case, it's the early church and how the early church is doing. So as we get into the Sunday school lesson, one of the questions that they ask is, have you ever experienced a challenge that changed you physically? What was that challenge? How did it change you? Is there anything like that in your life that has, impacted you in that way?
Not a physical challenge, I don't think. Not that has changed me forever. Like when I think of the physical challenge that changed physically, like I think about when I was younger, working out and being sore for the next few days. It reminds you of what you did. And I think that sometimes our physical challenges can kind of be that way in life. It teaches the growth process, show us what God has done in our lives. But I've never had a physical challenge that like changed me completely. Not to the way that I think it would have life altering.
Yeah, one of the things that has happened to me was when I blew my knee out in college playing soccer at Williams, and that has had some long-lasting effects. Even after knee surgery and getting it fixed, it's never been 100% right. But same question now about spiritual walk and spiritual changes.
Spiritually, announcing my full-time call to ministry was a significant change in my life because it kind of solidified a little bit in my mind where I was going to be for the rest of my life, but also it kind of called me to a higher standard a little bit. Like now that you are saying you're wanting this, and if God's truly calling you to this, you better make it everything you've got. So I think that's probably the biggest change in my life, the biggest challenge and the biggest change.
Yeah. I think my calling ministry is same thing for me. Just the difference in trajectory that my life took, how things are different now than where they were headed before, and all those things. All that's changed. I want to look at one of the things that it says here. It says that God will allow nothing to stand in the way of the proclamation of His gospel and the expansion of His church. And I think that's a really important key to think about as we go through Acts 5, 1 through 11, and or 1 through 42, just because that we see how God orchestrates things to make sure that His gospel is promoted.
Yeah.
So let's go ahead and get into the verses. When we look at this first section, it's Acts 5, 1 through 11. And I won't read the whole thing, but this section is about Ananias and Sapphira and what they did to lie to the Lord. I do want to read a little bit of it. I want to start in verse 1. It says, "But a man named Ananias with his wife Sapphira sold a piece of property. However, he kept back part of the proceeds with his wife's knowledge and brought a portion of it and laid it at the apostles' feet." And so basically what we see going on here is that Ananias and Sapphira have a desire to, get one over on the church. They want to look better than they are, but they still want to be deceitful and keep part of that money. And the reason they do that, if we look back at chapter 4, the last verse of 34, it says, Joseph, a Levite from Cyprus by birth, the one the apostles called Barnabas, which is translated son of encouragement, sold a field that he owned, brought the money, and laid it at the apostles' feet. And he gets a lot of praise and encouragement from all the people that are there, and a lot of recognition. And then it immediately goes into the story of Ananias and Sapphira, who appear to be doing the same thing but do something different. So how do you see this playing out? Like, what are some things in your mind that kind of stick out to you from this story of Ananias and Sapphira?
So one thing that I would like to kind of point to is one of the questions in the Bible study specifically, and it's, what do you think motivated Ananias and Sapphira to behave the way they did? And what I want you to pull out of this question, and what you need to really think about in this particular set of verses, is motivation. What is your motivation for doing things? Their motivation for bringing this was to look good in front of everybody. Mm-hmm. Their motivation to bring this gift was to say, hey, look, this is what we did. And if we look at the story, they told them what they did, but it really wasn't what they did. Yep. They didn't sell the whole plot of land and give everything to the church. They gave a portion of it to the church. So what is the motivation? And then it's simply what is the motive of them lying, and what would they gain? And it really boils down to pride, and wanting to make something more of yourself and less of God. And we see that in a world we live in today, that motivation is very much the same.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they were greedy. They wanted to deceive people, make themselves look better than they were. They were wanting to make sure that they looked good, probably got some of the praise and recognition that Barnabas got. And when it comes down to the bottom line, they were just hypocrites. And one of the verbs that's used here, when it says that they kept back part of the proceeds, that verb kept back in Greek means to pilfer or to embezzle. And so they were proclaiming that this was God's money, but then they decided in the process too that they were going to keep it. And nobody said they had to give it. Nobody said they had to sell the land. This was just something that they thought they were going to do to look good, and that was the end of it. Which is, when we apply that to today, I think we have a lot of those same issues. And Cody, I want you to speak to this too. But, I know from just growing up in church and being in churches across the United States and in other countries, people want to look good and they want to have a certain air at church, but that's not who they really are in themselves. They're lying. Right. And so they may not be lying about the financial side of things. And they could be, people may be saying this is my tithe, but they're really holding some back, mm-hmm. Who knows? But there are these things in life that people act better than, or act a certain way, and that's not really who they are. And I don't know, have you seen kind of that same thing in church too, or is that just me, or how does that?
No, I think that's Western Christianity as a whole. I think as far as when we think about church, we make it more of a religious checkbox than it really is a relationship and a mirror image of our worship towards Him. Because really, essentially, that's what it's supposed to be when we come here, is we come together as people that are all in one accord, holding all things in common, which is God, worshiping Him and giving Him thanks. But if our mirror of what we think about being here is just to check a box and to make people think that we're doing the right thing, then we're not worshiping Him, we're worshiping ourselves. Yeah. So that's a large issue, but if you look at it church-wise and really boil it down to what we need to do, it all goes back to that previous question of what's your motivation.
Yep. Yeah. And I think that's really important is our motivation to make God look good and to give all praise to God, or is our motivation, to make us look good, to make what we do look good so we can promote ourselves? So the story of Ananias and Sapphira, of course, Ananias goes before Peter. Peter, through the Holy Spirit, knows what's happening. Ananias dies. Sapphira comes in. He asks her the same question, and she gives the same answer, and she dies. And so one of the things that really stands out to me from that is just how God is punishing and showing his desire for things to be done correctly in the church. And so, we may not see people die immediately nowadays, but we know that God is still going to make sure that things are carried out correctly in the church. And that's why I think this first comment was interesting. God will allow nothing to stand in the way of the proclamation of the gospel and expansion of his church. So what we're seeing here is that there's some disunity and some discord within the church that God is weeding out and rooting out. And how does God do that today? How does God apply those same principles today? Do you think that he's still rooting out those things? Does he let things kind of slide and takes care of those things later?
I don't think
how does that work?
I don't think he's letting them slide. I do think that we are all going to have consequences for what we do. It's just a different timing on when we're going to have those consequences. And the sad thing is it's not even going to be us that reaps the consequences. It's going to be everybody and that's connected, which is why it's so important to really kind of hold your personal life with Christ so high to be the first standard that you work on, because everything else around it is affected by that one decision. And I don't think it's God's letting it slide. We don't see people dropping dead in the church because they're doing something wrong or their heart's wrong. But we do see lives being hurt and sin demolishing families and stuff like that. And sometimes I think that's the consequence. It's not God punishing you. It's actually God allowing the situations you've created to fully roll out.
Yeah, I think that does happen quite a bit, and we are responsible for our actions, and when we do things that are incorrect, those actions have consequences every single time. One of the things that I think is really interesting too is the relationship between Ananias and Sapphira and God. And we talk a lot about how God has created an order both in life and within the family. And of course, within the family, God has ordained the husband as the head of the house. The wife is a helpmate, which the helpmate there means meets fixes the poor qualities of the leader, right? So it's not like, oh, this is my helper. No, this is the person that completes me, that helps me to do things correctly. But what's interesting is that Ananias and Sapphira conspire together. But then she should have, instead of just going with what Ananias said, she should have also been following God's commands. So this is really interesting that, even in this case, Sapphira should have followed what God said and done things correctly according to his word, as opposed to doing what Ananias said. And that also kind of harkens back to the whole, do we obey government? Do we obey God? Well, in the cases where what the government tells us opposes what God says, we always go back to the higher authority, which is what God tells us. So it's just a really interesting thing happening.
I would even say that Ananias didn't tell Sapphira what to do, because if you look at Scripture, it says with his wife's consent. So he didn't tell her. He didn't even comment to her, "Hey, we're gonna do this." He had the money. He said, "It would be pretty cool if we could hold some of this back." And she said, "That's a great idea." So it was a mutual consent. It wasn't even that she was told what to do and she did it anyway. It was she consented just as much as he consented, so they paid the same price.
And I think that's really important. You got a marriage, and you both need to be following after God correctly. Or maybe one of the spouses isn't following God correctly, but it's still important for the other one to follow after God correctly. So that's where our marriages, we've got to base them on what the Bible tells us. So they both die. They're in the grave now. And notice, I think verse 12 through 16 is really interesting, because then some things start changing. So notice verse 12, many signs and wonders were being done among the people through the hands of the apostles. They were all together in Solomon's colonnade. And 13 is a really interesting verse. No one else dared to join them, but the people spoke well of them. Believers were added to the Lord in increasing numbers, multitudes of both men and women. So, Cody, what do you think about 13? It says no one else dared to join them, but then 14 says, but believers were added to the Lord in increasing numbers at the same time. So they almost seem like opposing statements.
Yes. So, and actually, our little Sunday school breakdown does a really good job of describing this. It says, the text seems to indicate that Ananias and Sapphira if they had not been punished, the works may have diminished. And what I really want to get to in here is that does not mean that God's power is limited. What that means is his people, because of sin, have distanced themselves from him. So their belief in him and him working through them is weakened.
Yep.
The barrier between them is causing issues. And I think that's a perfect example of why these people, and if you look at 13 and 14, it says people were scared to go near them, but people were still saved. And I think it was because they're looking at it like, man, if those people were just like them, if we go in there, we're going to die. And it's a lot like the Old Testament, like the priest. If the priest didn't come completely clean when he presented the sacrifices, they had to drag him out by a rope. And I think that is why I think we kind of distance ourselves from our relationship with God. We create those boxes for him to be in, because when we fully get to where we're really in a relationship with God, removing those things from our life is painful, and it feels like we're dying.
Yep.
And because of that, we don't like that feeling. So we backtrack a little bit, but it could also be why we're not seeing these miraculous works of God in today's world outwardly, like manna falling from heaven and him doing those things, healing people like he's healing people here, because we have little belief. And we're pulling ourselves away, and the stuff that's in between us and him has gotten us to where we don't have the same power as we would have had we not had it there. So that's kind of, I think it does a really good job of saying that, but it doesn't let you know that it's not God's power being limited. It's our belief being limited, creating us not to be able to do what he's actually called us to do.
Yeah. It's like, you plug in a fuse to the electricity. The electricity coming in your house hasn't been diminished, but the fuse keeps burning up because the fuse can't handle it. And so the fuse has to be capable of taking the current. I think that's the same with us. We need to make sure
you have to prepare yourself
that we are doing
to get what
God
you're
said.
supposed to get.
Yeah. I think it's really interesting that the people were scared to go because of that. But remember, 13 is talking about no one else dared to join them. Well, who's the them? Remember, in chapter 4, they're all holding things in common, and all these people are together, living together, and so no one else wants to join that. They don't want to go join them living in that community together, but they're still being saved. They're just not joining that community of having everything held in together as one.
Yeah, and it tells you in verse 12. The apostles are performing miracles, and all of the believers are worshiping. So it's the entire following that they're watching in Solomon's colonnade. So they're like, I don't know about this movement.
Yeah. So 13 and 14, they're not contradictory.
No.
It's very clear that no one's joining the community that's holding everything in common, but they're still being believers that are being converted along the way. So they're all in fear. They're all in awe of what God has done, and this story of Ananias and Sapphira is a refining fire within the church, because God is demonstrating that He's not going to allow disunity and discord and issues within the church to stop His message from being preached, and we see that happen because of the awe and the fear that's happened. We see that now all these signs are being done. They're preaching. They're teaching. They are bold for the gospel, even more so than they were before. And so now they're going out and they're teaching what's happening. So then we get to 17 through 41, or 17 through 26. And in these sections, we see that the apostles are now being persecuted for their beliefs. And they go back to trial. So we've seen last week that they go before the Sanhedrin just like Jesus did. So now they're being called back to the Sanhedrin again, and they go to this high priest. And long story short, they tell them you can't preach the gospel. You can't be doing and teaching things about Jesus. And so all of these things are happening. They put him in jail. They get, the Lord opens up the jail. They get out. And they go right back to teaching in the temple, right? So they are, even though there's oppression from outside the church now, we saw oppression within the church, now there's oppression outside the church, they are still telling people about Jesus. And that gets us to verse 29. And Peter and the apostles are responding to the order of, didn't we strictly tell you not to teach in his name? And Peter says, we must obey God rather than people. Mm-hmm. What are your thoughts on that, that whole context in that verse?
So we see it a lot in our culture today where the church changes to the culture. Mm-hmm. And whether it means that they grow in number or they grow in monetary value, they will change their views to the culture to fit what gets people in the door. And I think Peter is telling them here, we're not going to change to your culture just because of what you want us to do. We're going to do what God's called us to do. And it doesn't really matter the circumstances of what we're going to get in return. No. And one thing, and I would like to point this out too, the reason why the Sadducees and the Pharisees are so mad here, it's not just because they don't believe in Jesus. It's because they're jealous of the following they've got. They don't have the number of following that these people do. They don't have the community that they have. They don't have the wealth that they have right now. So the Pharisees and Sadducees are really kind of mad. They're more mad because they aren't doing what they're doing. So again, they're acting out of jealousy to shut this down, just a lot like they shut Jesus down and hung him. They killed him because they were jealous of him, not because they didn't believe him. Mm-hmm. They hated him because he was doing something they couldn't do.
Yep.
So that I want that to be really shown here, but the main portion of what that really is getting to is we have to do what God says, even if the world says that's not what we want.
Yep. Yeah, we got to be careful of that. And the Pharisee, the Sanhedrin, man, they hated the fact that they were losing their power, and that these apostles were coming in and they just had a following that was crazy. And I think you hit the nail on the head on that one. I think it's really important for us to remember that we must always obey God rather than people. Again, God puts our government in place to have authority over us, but God is the one giving them power. But no matter what happens, we must obey God first. And so if there are laws of men or people telling us that we can't do something that God has told us that we are required to do, we always have to follow what Jesus is telling us, what God is telling us. We get down into the end of the passage. This last part is Gamaliel's advice, and Gamaliel's a really important guy. He's Paul's mentor. Yeah. And so he's teaching Paul all the things that is going on, and we see just in the chapter 7, I think, when Stephen is killed, everybody lays their garments down at Saul's feet. But it's interesting here because Gamaliel is a teacher and he's a Pharisee, but he has some restraint and he has some thought that's very important. And so basically what he does, he goes through and he says, hey, men, we need to be really careful about oppressing these men, because if they are of God, there's nothing we can do to stop them.
Right.
However, if they aren't of God, it's just going to fade away. And he brings up about this Theudas who claimed to be somebody, but then it just kind of went away. And he is saying, if Christianity, if these believers are real and it is of God, there's nothing that we can do to stop the movement. And that's basically the gist of this section. So what do you think about that statement, Cody? If this is a movement of God that we see in Acts chapter 5, is it something that's going to fade away?
So and it all goes back to the beginning question we talked about. What is your motivation? If your motive is that you are going to let God do what He needs to do and just use you to do it, it will be a movement of God and it won't fade. It's not going to go away. And we clearly see this here because they decided to listen to Gamaliel here and let them go and let them do what they need to do.
With some flogging.
With some, I mean,
Yeah.
they spanked him a little bit in essence,
Yeah.
and said, hey, please don't do this again. But essentially, you see the reins kind of pull back a little bit on them really persecuting them so much to where now it's like, okay, we'll just let this fade, and it doesn't. Which is why you see the persecution ramp back up again. They're like, wait a minute, this isn't fading. We got to handle this again.
Yep.
But I really think that he's kind of he's got like a two-edged sword here. He really wants to shut this down because he's a Pharisee of Pharisees, but he also wants to see what it's going to end in. Like he's really, I think it's almost like his interest is peaking here. It's like, okay, we killed this guy on the cross. Apparently he came back. Now he's gone to heaven and his followers are doing the same thing he did. What's going on with this?
Yeah.
Because they had to have seen something out of that. But we also see that he really still doesn't believe because he still punishes them for what they're doing. And the fact that Peter is happy about what happens is like, woohoo, I just got beaten. Let's go back and get back to the temple. I think we need more of that in our church today.
Yeah, and I think the sheer fact that Christianity has lasted the last 2,000 years, I mean, this was, probably AD 33 still.
Yeah.
It has been almost exactly 2,000 years since this happened, and Christianity has grown. There are millions of believers around the world, and we're reaching still the corners of the earth. There are some places that still haven't been reached, some tribes and nations that we're trying to get to, but the gospel has persisted and grown even from this point. And I think if Gamaliel could go back and look at it 2,000 years later, he would say, yep, it was of God because it has lasted.
Right.
And I think that should give us confidence in what we believe and what the Bible teaches us, because if it wouldn't have been for God, as in the case of Theudas and some of the other illustrations, Judas, Galilean that rose up, if Christianity would have been something like that, it would have completely faded away. Nobody would ever remember it.
Right.
But God has caused His word to last and be persistent. And I think that goes back to this first kind of statement that we had in the lesson, which was God will allow nothing to stand in the way of the proclamation of His gospel and the expansion of this church. And so He is working to make sure that His church, that His gospel is something that will remain and will last throughout humanity. And so we can have confidence that we are following the one true God simply by the fact that all of this, of the gospel of Jesus Christ, this, the story of Jesus has continued for 2,000 years.
Right. And one thing that I really want to make sure that we remember here is these persecutions that they were facing are supposed to be normal. Mm-hmm. Like, we look at this and go, man, that's awful. But these were supposed to be normal. And I think that's why Peter finds it so joyful towards the end of this, is because he knew this was coming. Like, he knew it was going to happen. Jesus mentioned it multiple times. You're going to suffer for me. You're going to be persecuted. And when we think about it in this sense, these are the things that God was talking about, especially like in Ephesians 6, when he says you're not going to be fighting wars. You're going to be fighting principalities. You're going to be fighting people that don't believe like you. You're going to be fighting people that are in power that don't think like you and want to punish you for that. Mm-hmm. But don't fear, he says in John, I think it's chapter 16, that don't fear because I've overcome the world. So you're going to have these battles. You're going to have these persecutions. And take what they give you in joyfulness, because that means you're doing what God's asked you to do.
Yep.
And then move forward and take on that, knowing that He has overcome the world. That even though it may be tough right now in the battle you're in, you've won the war.
Yeah. So just kind of in closing, and this isn't one of the questions that's on here, but if we truly lived every single day as if, and it's true, but with the thought that what we believe in, what the Bible says is 100% true, and that God has given us the power and authority to share God's word. And we really believe that. How do you think that just the way we lived our daily life would be different?
It'd be drastically different. Would be thought of as radical. If we look at it nowadays, and I kind of look at it this way: if you're wanting to see what God's going to do in your life wholly, and you give Him everything, start living your life like you have to earn His salvation. That every day when you wake up, you have to do something in His favor to earn the salvation. Now we know you don't have to, and that's not what He wanted you to do. But if you lived every day like you had to, and like you had to pay a debt back to Him, what would the world look like?
Well, and I think in essence, that's how we earn fruit, right?
Yeah.
So, salvation is free. We don't do anything to earn it. But then Paul talks about, living out your faith, earning your salvation. In other words, you've already received it, but now that doesn't mean that you just get to lay around and eat potato chips the rest of your life.
Right.
Like you gotta demonstrate that was actually something that was true, and there has to be fruit that comes from it.
Yes.
He says you got to work out your faith. And so I think that's, I think you're right. If we lived as though we knew that this was, and we know it, mentally we understand it.
Yes.
But if we had that in our heart, like we believed it, it's in our heart, man, we know this is true.
If we physically lived out like we had a debt to pay.
Exactly. We would be doing radical things for Jesus because we know that our time here is short.
Right.
We're only given a short amount of time. He has plans for us. There are people dying and going to hell every single day. And we are the ones that God has given the ability to go and share the gospel. And that's plan A.
Yes. And
there's no plan B.
In today's culture, radical is thought to be a negative thing.
Yep.
When you hear the word radical, a lot of times the press will tie it to terrorism. And really what radical means is just
sold out.
You're sold out for a certain thing. And if we're radical for the belief in Jesus Christ, we're going to look different than everybody else around us. That's the point. That's why it's being radical. You're sold out. They know you believe that way. They're not going to question your belief. And if you think about what Peter says later as be a peculiar people, be weird, be different, be something that looks totally different than what everybody else sees. And that's really what God is looking for. Open your heart up enough to where you're going to allow Him to come in and make you look different, because you're not going to look different of yourself. He will make you look different.
We got to rely on Jesus to change us and make us who we need to be, 100%. Any closing thoughts?
Nope. I think that's all I've got.
Well, I appreciate all of y'all joining us today for episode 3, and we look forward to seeing you next week. Again, I hope this is something that is helping you in your preparation for your Sunday school classes on Sunday morning.